Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being with Henri Bergson still. So this is video 18. We're nearing the end of this series. I think it's going to run probably 20 sections. I think we will finish in 2 more videos, not including this one. That's kind of the plan anyway. But anyway, this video is about the Elan vital. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but it's, you know what I'm talking about, that vital impulse that is at the kind of core of life for Bergson. It's at the heart of his metaphysics. So, starting from the materialist perspective, what does Bergson say about this one? Materialism attempts to form the living from the inorganic, and idealism does the exact opposite. It tries to form the inorganic from the living, from life. And the problem with this is that both of these only see a difference of degree between living and non-living, between animate and inanimate. And the difference is manifest in the case of materialism, complexity. The more complexity you have in an aggregate of matter, then you have this progression towards living, towards life, towards mind. And in the case of idealism, perhaps intensity is the key. So maybe a higher degree of intensity is your consciousness, your mind, life, and as that intensity wanes, then you get inorganic matter. And that's how Bergson sees these two positions, materialism and idealism. But what he's going to say is that the two are, what that does is places materialism and idealism kind of at two ends of a spectrum, but they're on the same spectrum, and you can progress from one to the other depending on, just by manipulating a variable. And that's not how Bergson sees this. He says matter and mind are completely different things. So he's fundamentally dualist. He says that in Matter and Memory. So the two are completely different and irreducible to each other. Matter and mind, the non-organic, the organic. And this is a kind of a theme that we've seen in Bergson before, right? He often takes things two things that we tend to put on one spectrum at different ends of the same spectrum. We saw this with memory and perception. It's often thought that memory is like a weakened perception. But for Bergson, memory and perception are completely different things. And again, we see that here, taking two things that we typically think are connected or at different ends of the same spectrum, and drawing a clearer distinction. And this is the way it's often phrased, there's not a difference in degree here, there's a difference in kind. So what that tells us, if we want to kind of delve deeper into the metaphysical origins here, intellect and matter then have to be derived from a wider and higher form of existence. We cannot make the genesis of the one without making the genesis of the other. An identical process must have cut out matter and the intellect at the same time from a stuff that contained both. And that is also something we've seen before as well when we looked at evolution and life, that you've got two branches. Bergson wants to trace it back, not to reduce one to the other, but to trace both of them back into an original source which contained not both of them and not either of them in the current form that they are, but it contains something like the potential for both. And so that's how Bergson's, that's in all of Bergson's philosophy. That's the way he approaches, well, all of Bergson's philosophy. I guess it's in his philosophy of life, the way he understands life, the way he understands evolution, the way things evolve. You've got two separate things. If you have two separate things and you can trace them back to a common source, that source will have the potential for both, but it won't reduce to one or the other. That's kind of, that puts you in that kind of substance way of thinking that leaves you with either, you know, a materialist conception, everything's matter, an idealist conception, everything's mind, or a dualism in which the two kind of can't work together at all, and there's a fundamental split, which is Cartesianism. So for Bergson, they meet in this original stuff, and it contains both, not as they are now. So we don't have matter and mind kind of preserved in this one other substance. It's more like there's a potential for both to arise from this, and that's what we'll see as we go on. So mind and matter arise out of the same movement. They just move in opposite directions. And that's the way we're going to think about this. The first direction is a tension. Bergson characterizes this as a tension or an effort. And it's an effort that gathers up the past and thrusts it into the present, which it creates by entering. And you'll note that is exactly how I've defined duration in previous videos. There's, you have in the natural world, you've got this succession of events taking place one after the other, and what duration is just the capacity of a being to take not each of those individual events separately, but to apprehend them in a totality, apprehend a collection of them together. And when you do that, those events get merged into each other. So you don't get each separate moment discrete and individual, independent from all of the others. You get this collection. And that's what duration is. And that's what this tension or effort is that Bergson's talking about here. And obviously it's not a deliberate thing, right? We're not deliberately doing this. It's not something we're actively doing. It's just the way that we have developed, we have evolved as living beings. The nature of what it is to be a living being is that it apprehends things, and through perception, it apprehends not discrete individual events, but it collects them, it lumps them together, and then and when it does that, it apprehends a whole bunch of these events at the same time, kind of merging them, interpenetrating all of these events together, so that you get this whole, which is different from the separate parts that make it up. So that's the first direction in this, in the direction of this tension or effort. So psychical existence inclines in this direction. We've kind of seen that already. Mind, consciousness inclines in this direction, but never completely achieves it. So there's no such thing as perfect consciousness, mind unadulterated with matter. It's not, that's an ideal position. What we can say is psychical existence inclines in this direction, but it never achieves it completely. And this tension or effort manifests itself in wholes. So we have to think about wholes when we do this. When we're when we're following this line, this direction out of that originary impetus. Duration is another. It's basically exactly what this tension is. It's duration. So time features in this branch, if you like, from the originary impetus. And just a couple of notes about duration. I've talked about this in a lot of detail before, but just to remind you, duration or time, it's not a dimension separate from us. It's not something we are moving through. That's a spatial way of thinking about it. Rather, it's a process, and that's the key word here. It's a process. It's not a thing. We've got to stop thinking about these important concepts in metaphysics as things. That's what locks us into either the materialist position or the idealist position or the dualist position. We think of these fundamental ideas as fixed things, as things that exist in and of themselves, as what they are. Time, duration, it's not a thing, it's not a substance, it's not something that exists separate from us, which we live within. It's a process in the full sense of that word. So it's a process that arises naturally with us in this tension, in the playing out, in the enacting of this tension. That is what duration is. That prolonging of a succession of events into each other. It's that interpenetration and the contraction of this whole so that it's apprehensible in a single intuition. That process is duration. We can't look for duration anywhere else. We can't look for time anywhere else. It's in that process. So it's something fundamentally not non-physical. That's not the right way to think about it, but non-substantial. It is kind of a hazy concept to come to grips with, because there isn't anything to get a hold of. It's literally, there isn't anything to grasp, to conceptualize. It's purely a process. And so it's no good asking, okay, so you've got this process of prolonging of a succession of events, contracting them into a single intuition, but how does that create time? That's still thinking in terms of substance. It's thinking of time as a separate dimension, something super added to reality. That process is duration. There is nothing else. It doesn't create duration. It doesn't create time. That is time. And the other characteristic of this direction, this tension or effort, is it's a positive tendency. So it has, it's kind of the if you like, it's like the active half of the splitting up of this originary impetus. So there are four things there that kind of make up the tension direction of that we're talking about here. Psychical existence, manifest in wholes, duration, and it's a positive tendency. And this correlates with the other branch, the other lane that our originary impetus has split up into. And so this other side is a detension, or a relaxation, or an interruption. These are all words that Bergson uses. A relaxation and interruption of that fundamental effort that we talked about before, of that tension. So when that tension is relaxed, then you find yourself in the second, heading in the second direction. And so in this direction, there is only, the tension is a gathering up of the past, thrusting it into the present, that succession of events, blah, blah, blah. The relaxation of this means that there is no duration. There is just the instant. each succession of events is registered independently of the others. There is no sense of duration or continuity or movement, because you've relaxed that tension, you've let go of that effort of holding everything together in a single intuition, of gathering up all of those events, of prolonging them into each other, contracting them into a single intuition. That process takes effort. So Bergson describes it as attention. This other direction that you can move is the relaxation of that, letting go of that tension. And that's when you just have the succession of events, and each event is an individual, separate, discrete moment. So here, matter inclines in this direction. But again, as we saw with psychical existence, it never completely achieves it. The notion of pure matter that doesn't endure at all is again, it's an idealist conception. It's an ideal, I should say. So it doesn't actually occur in reality. Matter is always tempered with a little bit of duration. Neither of these things exist as pure states. It's manifest in parts, in contrast to the tension, which was manifest in wholes. And as where we saw with the tension, the important one of those four characteristics was duration or time. So it is with the detention that we are dealing with space here, or extension, kind of linking that there too. So Bergson goes into a nice little segue here in creative evolution about how space arises. We haven't really talked about space too much, so this is kind of important. So space, first of all, as we saw with time, it's not a dimension separate from us. It's not a container or something in which we live. It's not something in addition, over and above what we normally think of as matter or the world. That's again going at it the wrong direction. It's a substance way of thinking about space. So space arises naturally from this detension. But the question is how. So first it's ideal. So first it arises in the mind. And specifically I think Bergson has in mind here the intellect, the capacity of the intellect. When we make ourselves self-conscious in the highest possible degree and then let ourselves fall back little by little, we get the feeling of extension. We have an extension of the self into recollections that are fixed and external to one another. In place of the tension it possessed as an indivisible active will. So here we have, you've got that original tension. Everything's collected, prolonged, contracted together, and then that's within the self, within ourselves. But when we relax that, when we let go of that tension and see ourselves as this collection of discrete events or discrete parts, then we get this feeling of extension. So everything is now separate from everything else, and everything is co-present. So this is within us, if you like. This is kind of an inner sense, an abstracted sense of space, breaking ourselves up into these separate co-present parts. But again, we have to bear in mind that this is not, even though I'm talking about it in this way, kind of an inner abstracted sense, it's not something that's happening. There is no inner realm, right? There is no Cartesian theatre. That's again slipping into a substance way of thinking about things. The mind that we're talking about here, when we think about ourselves, it's not taking place in some magical realm separate from everything else. The mind is happening in the universe. It's not happening in some Cartesian theatre which is kind of over and above. It has a separate existence over and above the rest of reality. It's all happening in the same place, in the universe, in reality. So even though I say it's taking place in the mind, that shouldn't lead you to think that we're talking about a Cartesian theatre somewhere. It's just that this feeling of extension comes about once a being, an organism, achieves a level of intellect such that it can think of itself in terms of extension, such that it can divide itself into these parts, these co-present parts. And so once it does that, then it gets this feeling of extension. And what it means is that the extent to which a creature is capable of intellectual activity is the extent to which this inner feeling of extension can be felt. Which means that there is no space for creatures or for beings that lack that capacity. And that's fine. That seems to gel with me, right? So you go down the ladder of conscious creatures, and you'll eventually get to a point. And if you don't get to a point on that ladder, as you go down into the non-conscious, that's when this will kick in. There's no space. There's no space for the table in relation to the chair. The table doesn't feel itself in any kind of spatial relation with the chair. So space disappears at some point. And that's because it's fundamentally, like I said, it's connected with this tension. And all it is the inverse of that tension. It's a detension, inclining in the opposite direction. So it takes place first in this kind of mental sense. That's the first step. And then secondly, we apply this sense of extension to the world, to the external world around us. Again, not deliberately, not actively. It's not something we have to mentally try and do. But it happens through evolution, according to the dictates of practical action. So again, another thing that we've talked about before, matter or different objects is an artificial breaking up of the whole. So that way of apprehending the whole in terms of parts is an artificial breaking up of it. That's something that, again, when we're not deliberately doing it, it's just what it is to be an evolved human being. And you can't stop doing it. It's part of it's just part of what it is to be the beings that we are. So we take this kind of sense, this feeling of extension that we have developed, that we've become sensitive to through the intellect, and then apply it to the world around us. The idea that the mind, forms of pure space, is only the schema of the limit at which this movement would end. Once in possession of the form of space, mind uses it like a net with meshes that can be made and unmade at will, which, thrown over matter, divides it as the needs of our action demand. So I think that just kind of brings that idea home. Space is the consequence of the tendency of the mind to abstract parts from the whole, which does not mean that space or matter isn't real. it's not an illusion. It's as real as you. It's as real as your brain or your body. It's just not metaphysically foundational in the sense, at the point where we've gone back to here, to this originary impetus prior to mind and matter, prior to that tension and that detension. At that level, then there is no space. But once that originary impetus has branched out along these two tracks, or in these two directions, might be a better way to think about it, tending in these two directions, then we're abstracting parts from the whole. It's a different way of viewing reality, if you like. It's looking at reality from a different perspective, but a valid one, not one that's invalid. It doesn't mean that the world is illusory, right? That's the error of Buddhism, to think that everything, change, impermanence is not real. It's real. It's as real as you and you or me. It's as real as the things around us. It's real. Slow down, Nate. It's as real as your lives, our lives. To say that it's an illusion is it's just not the right way to think about it. It's not an illusion. It's just a different way of perceiving the whole. It's a different way of getting at reality. And finally, the last point, the last characteristic or feature of this detention track is that it's a negative tendency. Bergson describes it, characterizes it as a negative tendency. This is not moral. It's not good and bad, right and wrong, or even real and unreal. Right? It's not that kind of a negative, but negative in the sense that it's a breaking up of that tension. It's an interruption of that tension. So the tension is maybe active. It's not the right way either, but it's a funny way to think about it, positive and negative. But the tension is the movement that's really happening. In a sense, it's a little bit prior. I think that would be fair to say. It's a little bit. It's not earlier in the sense of time. It doesn't happen first. The two happen together, and always together. But it's a bit more. Yeah, there is a kind of a preference for this. I think this is the branch that is kind of moving forward, doing something. It's the active in the sense that it's gathering up this succession. It's prolonging them, contracting them into a single. It's doing something. But then the detention, it's not actually doing anything. It's just the relaxing of that tension, which again means that really there aren't two things here. There's one thing, and it's either in effect, under effort, under tension, or it's declining, it's moving, it's kind of unraveling. So that's kind of the way to think about this anyway. Hopefully that makes sense. I've got a little diagram which I'll just throw up for you as well. So on the left there you can see the first direction, if you like, the tension or the effort, and on the right is the detention, the relaxation, and you can see how the different features pair up with each other. Psychical existence on the left, matter on the right, wholes versus parts, duration or time versus space or extension, and then that positive tendency versus the negative tendency. So this whole discussion then, this whole way of thinking about it, makes the Elan vital, that vital process, literally a process. Again, that's the key word here. It's a process in the true sense of that word. And And I think almost all of the errors that come about when we think about life and when we try and think about metaphysics are because we tend to think in terms of substance. We think in terms of fixed things. And even when we want to say, but I mean, I know the thing changes. It's dynamic. It changes. There's still an underlying substrate. You're still thinking in terms of some fixed thing that undergoes a change. And that's the error that I think almost all metaphysics falls into, and certainly almost all thinking about consciousness these days falls into. We haven't gone past Cartesianism, I think. We're still locked in that substance way of thinking about consciousness, and when we do about these deeper metaphysical structures. So this whole thing is a process. There are, and this is, Bergson says this in the book somewhere, there are no things, there are only actions. And that, I think, if you can really get your head around that, there are no things, there are only actions, it's all process, then you will be well on your way to understanding exactly what Bergson's getting at here. So then this is basically, I've called this the key insight, but we've talked about it already. Both the tendencies to tension, duration, and detension, space, must be in the original impetus. They must be in that Elan vital. So the originary impulse generates form, creates, and a tension within this movement yields mind, and a detension, the arrest of this movement, constitutes matter. I think that's really that's the best way to think about this. You've got this primary, this vital impulse, originary impulse that generates form, that's creating, that's creative force, and a tension within that movement, within that originary impulse, yields mind, yields duration and time. And the detension, the inverse of that, the inhibition of that tension, yields space, matter, extension. And so I think that's a really nice metaphysical picture. I think it's clean, it's tidy, it's just got all of the elements of good philosophy in there for me. Bergson goes on to talk about, he's got a really interesting section actually about the second law of thermodynamics, and a way of thinking about this that I'd never thought of, but really ties in nicely with everything we've just talked about with this Elan vital. So the second law of thermodynamics, what is it? Entropy always increases. A closed system will always tend towards disorder. Bergson describes it as all physical changes have a tendency to be degraded into heat, and that heat tends to be distributed among bodies in a uniform manner. And it's the same thing, it's a different formulation of the second law, but that's too much detail for us. That's what it is anyway. Disorder always increases. So the problem then is that everything appears as if we're exhausting some reservoir of order or of organization. And the question is, where did this original order come from? How did we get this original organization, which is then steadily degrading into heat? And that's a question that physics is still grappling with. Where does the source of all this order come from? If everything is degrading into heat, if everything is tending to disorder, it means that there must have been a prior state of high order or high organization. And so where did that come from? How did that arise? And Bergson says that this is irresolvable as long as we remain within space. If we keep thinking in terms of matter or extension, this problem is irresolvable, because space is merely the negation of that tension, i.e. it's an abstraction, not in the sense that it's unreal, but in the sense that it's a part of a whole. It's a part of something else. So we'll never be able to understand the second law, this problem of where the order in the universe comes from, if we lock ourselves on that single track of space, because it's not the whole story. That space arises through a detension, through the inverse, the negation of that tension, which is the other movement in the originary impetus. So what we have with the second law is the idea of a thing unmaking itself. I think that's a really good way of describing this. The second law tells us that we've got this thing which is steadily over time unmaking itself. In vital activity, we see then that which subsists of the direct movement in the inverted movement, a reality which is making itself in a reality which is unmaking itself. A really novel way of thinking about the second law, I think. Novel to me anyway. I don't know. I mean, I'm not a physicist. I know of the second law, but I don't know of any of the, I'm not a physics expert. But to me, this seems like a really interesting way of thinking about it, and quite novel, especially when Bergson was writing this too, right, at the beginning of the 20th century. But this is exactly how we've been describing things. That detension and detension arising from this more originary impulse. This is exactly what Bergson has been describing. The reality which is making itself is the tension, that movement towards tension in the originary impulse. And the unmaking is the detention, the relaxing of that tension, again, in the originary impetus. So that's, I think, just a really nice idea there. He kind of starts it. He doesn't go on to really drill into the details of how this might work, but I think it kind of opens out a plan. It puts the second law into a deeper metaphysical framework that I think has been lacking. So just to continue here, I've got a couple of quotes which reinforce everything we've been talking about. If life were pure consciousness, so we had this tension only, if there was no detention, then it would be pure creative activity. There'd be no matter. But, as we said, there's always if you have the tension, you always have the detention. The two arise together. And certainly here on Earth, life is riveted to an organism that subjects it to the general laws of inert matter. But everything happens as if it were doing its utmost to set itself free from these laws. It has not the power to reverse the direction of physical changes. It does, however, behave absolutely as a force would behave, which, left to itself, would work in the inverse direction. Incapable of stopping the course of material changes downwards, it succeeds in retarding it. And another quote, the impetus of life of which we are speaking consists in a need of creation. It cannot create absolutely because it is confronted with matter, that is to say, with the movement that is the inverse of its own. But it seizes upon this matter, which is necessity itself, and strives to introduce into it the largest possible amount of indetermination and liberty. So those two quotes just I think, just trying to capture the essence of this idea that originary impetus, those two movements, and the way I described it at the beginning was two branches, right? Maybe it's a little bit deceptive to think about it, and it's a little bit misleading because you don't have two separate things. There's still this one movement, but it tends in two directions, and when it's under tension, when there's effort, then you get this tendency to mind, and the detension, that relaxation of that effort, tends to matter and space. But I think those two quotes just kind of bring everything in together quite nicely. So we've got this idea then, creation. The impetus of life is a need of creation. It's a fundamentally creative force. And how then, you might ask, is this process of creation, this establishment of indetermination and liberty, accomplished? Well, we've seen that it is through storing up usable energy, i.e., overcoming reflex actions in the animal, the conscious being. So that leads to the second key insight for me here, which is something that we've kind of, I think we've hinted at before, we never fully said it. Life is originally a tendency to accumulate in a reservoir. That's, I think, a key insight from creative evolution, and tells us something about this originary impetus. It's not something that we can completely define. We can't put a box around it, or we can't put it in a box, because it's not. It doesn't fit within our concepts, within our logic, within the context of our logic. But it doesn't mean we can't understand anything about it. And so this originary impetus, life, originally it's a tendency to accumulate in a reservoir, because that is where creativity is generated. That creates the potential for indetermination. If you just have events in succession, one by one, moment by moment, the registering of every single event as a discrete, separate, isolated part, then there's no potential for creation. There is no indetermination in that. To get that, you have to have this tension. You have to have not just separate, discrete moments, but you have to gather up these moments in some way and present them to yourself in a single intuition. And that's what living beings do. That's what we are as parts of the universe, not as separate things in addition to the material universe, but as parts of this universe that is both matter and mind, connected to each other, condensed, conjoined in this different thing, this thing which has the potential for both, but which is itself something different, this fundamentally creative process. So it's storing up of usable energy is where I left you before. We saw that this plays out in the course of evolution with plants, right? They store up energy from the sun. Then in the sensory motor systems of animals, and instinct and intellect, the way that we are able to receive sensory stimuli and hesitate before acting. Our responses are not direct and immediate. They are considered. We're able to take in more sensory stimuli before we act. So that introduction of hesitation, that's what the brain does for Bergson. It's just an organ of hesitation. It introduces separation between the stimulus and the response. And that's where indetermination comes from. And there's a nice analogy that Bergson has here to capture this idea. Life being a tendency to accumulate in a reservoir. If we imagine a vessel full of steam at pressure, and then cracks in this vessel through which the steam escapes, what happens next is the droplets, the steam condenses into droplets which fall down, which fall to earth, and this is the loss of that originary impulse. This is that detension, matter. But the steam itself, which is the tension or duration, persists for a short time. So it can't stop the falling droplets, but it can retard them. It can slow them down. So and that's actually, the more I think about it, the better I think the analogy is. You've got that vessel, you've got the sense of accumulation in a reservoir. That's what life fundamentally is. That's the creative force, the tendency to store up energy. And as the steam escapes from that vessel, it tends to degrade. It tends to become droplets which fall down, which fall back to earth. But the tension is what is fighting that force. The steam is still trying to move up, to continue on its upward trajectory, but it's being brought down, and it can't overcome that tendency to degrade, but it can slow it down. And that's exactly how Bergson talks about the originary impetus and those two directions, those two movements that take place within that impetus, that tension and that detention. I really like that. Actually, just in explaining it then, it's taken on a whole new kind of relevance for me. That I never thought of before. But anyway, cool. So one thing to be careful of here, though, with the analogy, there are no things here. There are no substances. Everything, the only things here are actions, process, creativity. It's all movement. It's all process. Again, process in the true sense of the word. Not process in the sense of something changing or something evolving. That still locks you in. You're still thinking in terms of substance. You've still got this notion, even though you might not be thinking about it, it might not be in the forefront of your mind, you're still thinking of a substrate underneath, which is on which everything happens. And that, like I say, that's the big mistake, the big thing to be wary of. So finally, the last thing I want to talk about is the one and the many. This comes up a couple of times for Bergson. It's a classic philosophical topic, right? The one and the many. And we talked about it with the self, where we saw that the self is neither one nor many. It's just the wrong way of thinking about the self. The self isn't, when you think about it as a whole, when you think about yourself as a whole, a totality, you can always change your perspective and think of yourself as broken up into different parts, different feelings, different beliefs, different emotions, feelings, different tendencies. All of these things you can see yourself in that sense. But if you think about yourself as a collection of parts, you can do the opposite and think about yourself as a whole. And the solution was we're neither one nor many. That those categories just don't apply to the self. And it's the exact same thing with life, because life is the same as consciousness. Now be careful with that, because that's different from saying life is conscious. It's not panpsychism, right? We don't want to go back to panpsychism. It's not idealism. We don't want to go back to this everything is consciousness, the universe is consciousness. That's not the right way to think about this. But life is the same as consciousness, and in that both, or metaphysically, life and consciousness are grounded in that movement of tension arising from the Elan vital, the originary impetus. And that, again, duration comes back in here, because it's also grounded in that tension. So to say that life and consciousness are the same is not to say that the universe is consciousness. That, to me, that doesn't even mean anything. But it's saying that they're grounded in this movement which arises from this originary impetus. Which means that, like the self, life is neither one nor many, but in the encounter with matter, it appears to be divided. In truth, these categories, like I said before, just don't apply to it. They don't apply to wholes, life as a totality. Because life is fundamentally creation, movement. These are all things that the analytic mind, with its way of thinking that is tailored to parts of the whole, just can't get any traction on. Life, and the reason is life is, it's not a thing, it's not a part, it's a whole, it's a process. It's a process, not a substance. And that is probably as good a place as any for me to wrap up with one last quote, which I'll leave you with before we head into the summary. In reality, life is a movement. Materiality is the inverse movement. And each of these two movements is simple. The matter which forms a world being an undivided flux, and undivided also the life that runs through it, cutting out in it living beings all along its track. Summary. So we talked about the Elan vital as an original impetus. That was the subject of the video. We broke this down into two movements. I talked about two branches. Like I said though earlier, it's a little bit misleading. It doesn't break up completely. It's more like you've got this one movement tending in two different directions. One of those movements, one of those directions is tension or effort. And it's the tension involved in taking a succession of events, prolonging each event into the others and contracting them into a single intuition. That is an effortful process. Duration arises from this, or that act is duration, perhaps that's the better way to put it, and this tends to psychical existence. But it never gets there completely. There's no such thing as pure tension here. The second movement, the second direction, was a detension or relaxation of that gathering, that effort involved in bringing those separate events all together and apprehending them in a single intuition. And this was characterized by space or extension. And this direction tends to matter. But again, never gets there completely. Even matter endures as a whole. If we think about the universe as a whole, the universe as a whole endures. Individual parts, inanimate parts of the universe, they don't endure. And linking this to the second law of thermodynamics, Bergson describes this movement as a reality which is making itself in a reality which is unmaking itself. So the reality making itself is that tension, the unmaking itself, the unmaking is that detension. And the final key insight that I had there, life is a tendency to accumulate in a reservoir. So life is a storing up of energy. That is the way that creativity can take place. That's the way that indetermination can enter into reality. And there was, of course, that nice analogy with the vessel full of steam under pressure, and as the steam escapes, condenses into droplets, the droplets falling, the detension, the steam retarding that falling is the tension. Okay, and that is Bergson on this vital impulse. Such a great idea, I think, a really deep metaphysical insight. And I really got a lot out of preparing for this. I read Creative Evolution. I've written my notes on it, but when I kind of had to put it all together for this video, things really clicked into place much tighter, I think, than they had before. So that's great, I guess, for me. Anyway, I don't know about you, but that's good for me. Thanks for watching, as always, and I will catch you in the next video.